All right. Well, everybody, for today's Socialist Sunday School, we read the first two chapters of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. We're going to go through the first chapter today, which examines how the theory of socialism developed from originally a utopian ideal to a method of evaluating society in a more scientific manner. And then we will also cover the second chapter, which presents the Marxist dialectic, which is a concept from which all Marxist analysis is built upon. Before we jump too far into the nitty-gritty, I think it's important just to point out why we're doing this and why the study of theory is important. Theory is the basis on which we analyze our current and past conditions so that we can act in a strategic manner to bring about socialism. And that is the crux of Marxism. It is a method that we use and through which we consciously understand our position to organize around that. And the initial ideas as developed are not fixed. Scientific socialism is a foundation meant to be built upon as our historical conditions develop. Now getting into the text. In the first section of the development of utopian socialism, Engels gives a review of some of the initialist socialist thinkers in Europe. See, formal thought, it hasn't come about at random. It's a product of the current material conditions of the time, having developed through history. Engels explains socialism is the origin of a theoretical form, and it can be described as a logical extension of the principles of Enlightenment. Enlightenment being a period in Europe that was characterized by philosophers critiquing everything, all the social structures, all the institutions, and they supported the power of humans' ability to think and reason, as opposed to the preceding order, which was like a blind faith and superstition and religion and theocracy kind of ruled. Several ideals dominated and characterized the Enlightenment thought, and conclusions included a heavy emphasis on reason, individualism, and skepticism. Engels both champions and mockingly criticizes the accomplishments of Enlightenment era thinkers, saying, "Now for the first time appeared the light of day, the kingdom of reason. Henceforth superstition, injustice, privilege, oppression were to be superseded by eternal truth, eternal right, equality based on nature, and the inalienable rights of man." But then he goes on to say, that we know today that this kingdom of reason was nothing more than the idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie, that this eternal right found its realization in bourgeois justice, that this equality reduced itself to bourgeois equality before the law, bourgeois property was proclaimed as one of the essential rights, and that the government of reason came into being and only could be a democratic bourgeois republic. So the contradictions of the feudal order, which Enlightenment thinkers sought to resolve, are the basis for the method of thought of these thinkers. We can understand how this was appropriate and necessary for dismantling the current ideology, like the divine right of kings, which upheld feudal order. So then utopian socialists started theorizing and critiquing this new mode of production in bourgeois democracy. To really understand this text, I think it's important to first define some of the concepts. Defining metaphysics. Metaphysics is a philosophy that uses broad concepts to help define reality and our understanding of it. It's like the big why. Why is everything what it is? Idealism and materialism are two models of understanding metaphysics. The utopian theory of socialism was characterized by idealism. Idealism can be described as a model of social theory that asserts that reality is nothing but what is constructed in human consciousness. And in extension, the state of mind of the people in a given society is what is catalyst for change. Now, this is counter to the materialist model, which asserts that human consciousness is a product of a person's material and economic conditions. So the utopians perceive the course of history to be made by consciousness and reason, Enlightenment reason. But this new socialist theory is deeply connected to the schools of thought of the time, but it was also connected to critiquing the economic fact. So the utopian socialists just to give some cliff notes on them and some of the progressive thought that they had for their time. Saint Simon he was French. They called him a son of the French Revolution. Engels called him a son of the French Revolution. He observed that during the French Revolution, the Third Estate, which is the party that was opposed to the monarchy, only a small part of that developed into the bourgeois by buying up church land and military contracts, leaving France on the verge of ruin, and that left it vulnerable to the coup d'etat by Napoleon. Simon sees the main conflict between workers and idlers, thinking that every man should work. He doesn't believe that the poor can govern based on what happened during the Reign of Terror. And he declares that politics is the science of production and predicts the absorption of politics by economics. And he does develop the concept of the abolition of the state and political rule eventually being a mere administration of production. We have Fourier. He was French. He was a critic of bourgeois democracy in the mode of production. He pointed out the hypocrisy of the ideals that were preached, and yet when pursued had the opposite effect on all of the people. He was one of the first to declare that in any given society, the degree of women's emancipation is a natural measure of general emancipation. And he did conceptualize the history of society as an evolution. He also noticed that society was moving in a manner that while it reproduces contradictions it's unable to solve, it often arrives at its opposite. And so that's a precursor to a dialectical analysis of social development. A quote from the text, "Under civilization, poverty is born of superabundance itself." And then lastly, Robert Owen. He was an English utopian. He was a materialist, believing that man is a product of his environment. He was what you would call a good capitalist. He owned factories and such, and he gave his workers good working conditions. He was also philanthropic and supported schools and social institutions. But even so, he was not satisfied. He said of his workers that they were slaves at his mercy. And he began to question where this extra value came from that he was earning. And he believed that should be shared by all. So in preaching and attempting to implement communistic thought, he was exiled, even though when he was not criticizing the mode of production and he was just being philanthropic, he was praised. He did still go on to help implement laws, putting in max working hours for women and children. He led trade unions and developed worker co-ops, proving manufacture and merchant unnecessary. So Engels gripes about the utopians. He says, "To the utopians, socialism is the expression of absolute truth, reason, and justice, and has only to be discovered to conquer all the world by virtue of its own power. And as an absolute truth and independent of time, space, and the historical development of man, it is a mere accident when it is discovered." So to believe that virtue alone would simultaneously liberate all of humanity, that's to believe that the ruling class will willingly hand over power. And we know that's not true. With this thought development out of Enlightenment, they were unable to conceptualize capitalist class struggle. The utopian socialists did critique capitalism for the lie that the unbridled market competition would bring about human liberation, but they were limited to the formal thought of the time and thinking with an old idealist conception of history. They knew nothing of class struggle based upon economic interest, economic relations appeared incidental. Moving on to chapter 2. So chapter 2, Engels opens up his section on dialectics by crediting Hegel with taking up again of dialectics as the highest form of reason. Hegelian dialectics recognizes that all things are fluid, ever-changing, and in relation to other things. The Hegelian dialectic consists of 3 stages of development: a thesis, which is like the initial argument, and an antithesis, which is a contradiction, which disproves the initial thesis, and then a synthesis, which is the result of the process which resolves the contradiction. Quoting Engels, the 2 poles of an antithesis, positive and negative, are as inseparable as they are opposed, and that despite all their opposition, they mutually interpenetrate. And this evolves in perpetuity. Engels explains, when we consider and reflect upon nature at large, or the history of mankind, or our own intellectual activity, at first we see the picture of an endless entanglement of relations and reactions, permutations and combinations, in which nothing remains what, where, and as it is, but everything moves, changes, comes into being, and passes away. The seeds of the new can be found in the old, the new form solving for the contradictions of the old. And Engels goes on questioning the still frame manner in which thinkers have taken to observing all things, even the metaphysical. He proposes this is an extension of the methodology used to study empirical science. This leads to even philosophers reflexively perceiving ideas as isolated and fixed. He says, in the contemplation of individual things, it forgets the connection between them. In the contemplation of their existence, it forgets the beginning and the end of that existence. Of their repose, it forgets their motion. It cannot see the woods for the trees. Dialectics understands metaphysical ideas, or that the nature of existence is not static nor existing in a vacuum. Engels tells us that the natural world is the proof that dialectics is proof of dialectics, which Darwin proved through the theory of evolution. This is still a phenomenon we deal with in the modern context, and this way of looking at the world is still very common. Science and the scientific method, they obviously have made wonderful discoveries and improved our standards of living immensely. However, internal validity, how research extends to the general population, is still always a concern, and it often leads to false results. And that's why a lot of, research studies have to be redone all of the time because things are constantly evolving. A controlled experiment seeks to minimize variables and to draw a conclusion, but that's not how things actually work. And that has to be accounted for, especially in relation to things like social sciences and even medical sciences. And that's also why isolating and treating a single symptom of a system, that doesn't actually cure the ailment. Engels credits Hegel with unifying the whole world, natural, historical, intellectual, and represent it all as withgoing a process. But Hegel was flawed in his theory by nature of his idealist conception. To him, the thoughts within his brain were not more or less abstract pictures of actual things and processes, but conversely, things and their evolution were only the realized pictures of the idea existing somewhere in eternity before the world was. This eternal truth concept is inherently contradictory to understanding of dialectics, in which all things are evolving in a process and never static. And true to dialectics, Hegel's thesis is in contradiction to the antithesis, and the antithesis being dialectics as a mode of reasoning. In resolving that contradiction, we are led necessarily back to materialism. Yes, all things are an interrelated evolutionary process coming into an existence and ceasing to be, all things containing contradictory aspects. In this tension, the catalyst for change. This change is inherent to the nature of the material world, independent from mind or spirit. Engels tells us that this new understanding of dialectics as a concept of materialism requires us to re-examine all of past history, which we understand as a history of class struggles. That these warring classes of, this is an Engels quote, as a history of class struggles, that these warring classes of society are always the products of the mode of production and exchange. In a word, of the economic conditions of their time, that the economic structures of society always furnish the real basis, starting from which we can alone work out the ultimate explanation of the whole superstructure, judicial and political institutions, as well as of the religious, philosophical, and other ideas of a given historical period. So it is the economic basis that defines these. Because of the discoveries by Marx and Engels, the dialectical materialist conception of history and surplus value defining capitalism, we now understand socialism as a science. To quote Engels, "We understand socialism not as an abstract utopia, but as a necessary outcome between two historically developed classes. It is our job as Marxists to examine our material economic conditions and to discover the contradictions and solve them, moving us forward towards socialism."